founder, Dr. M.R. Duraswamy, Pro-Chancellor, Professor Jawahar Duraswamy, Shri Gurumurthy ji, faculty, students and alumni of PES University, a very, very good afternoon. And what a time it is to be an Indian. After some 800 odd years of decline, India is finally taking its place back in the Committee of Nations, its rightful place as the world's largest population, and hopefully within our lifetime, the world's largest economy. Very often when we have discussions on economic issues, they tend to be about quarterly GDP, about maybe even annual GDP. And yes, this year with 7% GDP growth rate, India will be by some margin the world's fastest growing large economy. However, what we are witnessing is not about quarterly and annual GDP growth rates. We are witnessing a major turning point in history, a renaissance, a rebirth of a civilization. So what I try to do, and all of us are participants in this journey, we are not trying to build an economy. We are trying to reignite a civilizational nation. And all of you are participants in this amazing journey. But to appreciate this, we need to go back a little bit into history to understand where we came from and what we are trying to rebuild. So if you went back more than 1,000 years ago, so between the years 0 AD to around about 1000 AD, India was, in fact, for much of human history, not just for those 1,000 years, the world's largest economy by some margin. We were 33% of the world economy, according to Angus Maddison. This was where the great universities were: Takshashila, Vikramshila, Nalanda. From world over, refugees, students, merchants came here. But it wasn't just an inward journey. Indian mariners sailed across the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is, after all, the only ocean named after a country, India. World history in many places is defined by India. If you go to Korea, Korean school children are taught that their history starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. If you read the history of Cambodia, it starts with an Indian merchant called Kaundinya, who sailed there somewhere in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century BC, we don't know exactly when, and married a local princess, Soma. That's where their history starts from. You go to Singapore, the name of that city-state is Singhapura, Singapore. It's a Sanskrit name. Singapore, Jaipur, Udaipur. Indonesia, having become independent in the 1940s, named itself Indonesia. The name is derived directly from India. Its national symbol, despite being a Muslim majority country, is Vishnu's Garuda. Their currency is the rupiah. In fact, they have spelt it correctly, not us. So the point I'm making is that there was a great India that inspired the world, led the world, and was genuinely a Vishwaguru. And it's not just about Buddhism and Hinduism, but many, many other things that spread around the world, both eastward and westward. Much of modern mathematics is derived from India. Chess is derived from India. Even the folk tales, like Aesop's fables, are derived directly from Hitopadesh and Panchatantra. And yet, this country that accounted for 33% of world GDP slowly went into, through a variety of reasons, its own sciences, philosophies fossilized. It was conquered by waves of invaders, and its share of GDP by the time of the Mughals had declined to less than 25% of world GDP. By the time the colonial period started in earnest in the early 20th century, it had fallen to 20% or less. And by the time the British left in 1947, we were down to 4% of world GDP. Unfortunately, after independence, we ourselves imposed ourselves on an economic system defined by socialism that set us back even further. And so by the time we began to liberalize our economy in 1991, our share of world economy had actually dipped to less than 2%. So it's only from somewhere in the late 90s that our share of world GDP began to creep up again. And it's only in the last decade or so we have finally gone past the share of world GDP we had in 1947. So very sadly, we spent some over 6 or 7 decades basically regaining our place in the world where we were when the British left us. But the good news is, the machine has now begun to run at a much faster rate. We are now beginning to rapidly gain back our share in the world economy. We are already, as you may be aware, the world's 5th largest economy in US dollar terms. In fact, in purchasing power terms, we already are the world's 3rd largest economy. In the next 18 months, we'll go past Germany and become the world's 4th largest economy. In another 18 months from that point, we will go past Japan and become the world's 3rd largest economy. However, remember, from there it's a long walk to where China and the US are. So it's not about just the next few years. We have to keep up this economic performance for at least a generation. At least a generation. The next 25 years, which Prime Minister Modi has called the Amrit Kal. And there will be many things in our favor during this time. This will be a time when our demographics will be in a sweet spot, when we will not yet have aged, and the inflow of large numbers of children will have also slowed down enough that a very large proportion of our population will be of working age. So this is our opportunity, the next 25 years, when the generation, most of whom are sitting here in the stands today, it is your generation that will make this happen. I hope to be around to see it happen and to be able to hand over the baton to you, but it's really your generation that will make it happen. And keeping this going for 25 years will be no easy task. As I said, there will be a demographic benefit dividend in our favor. We may also have the benefit of some geostrategic conditions. But none of this is given. There are other economies in the world that went through demographic change and weren't able to sustain it. Take, for example, many of the countries in Southeast Asia. In the 90s, it was thought that their rise was inevitable. And yes, for many years, they did manage to sustain high growth. And then, with an exception like Singapore and a couple of others, it all fell apart after the Asian crisis. You had countries like Sri Lanka, which used much of their high demographic phase in fighting a civil war and wasted it. So do not think that this is inevitable. It will require hard work in order to keep this machine running. It will require continuous reform. Reform is always uncomfortable. It means that there will be winners and losers. But keeping this society together, to be able to turn up on the other side of this with our ecological and social and cultural capital intact, will be no easy task. But we have to be willing to do this. And in order to do this, we will also have to keep our minds open We will have to have a society that is able to celebrate risk-taking. Not just risk-taking in terms of business and entrepreneurship, but in the ideas, in our way we think about the world and engage with the world, while simultaneously being able to remain rooted without losing our rootedness. And we will also have to be mindful of another problem. During this journey, there will be more than enough efforts to try and trip us. This is unfortunately something we need to be prepared for. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time speaking about this, but very often people tend to underestimate the possibility. And let me welcome an Honorable External Affairs Minister. So as I speak about India's Renaissance, it is important to recognize that this is not the first time we have gone through these cycles. We are a country that has gone through many ups and downs through our long history. During the Bronze Age, of course, we went through what is now known as the Harappan phase of civilization. We had a golden flowering of that civilization. And then, due to a number of reasons, particularly climate change, that civilization broke down. We went through another golden era during the Mauryan period. There was a flourishing of civilization, and then went through a downturn. There was another one through the first millennia, which I talked about earlier, the Gupta period, the great flourishing of civilizations in southern India, the Cholas, for example, and the Vijayanagar Empire, and then again a downturn. In each one of these things, there were a few characteristics that we need to remember. And sometimes it's very difficult to be able to tell this story from our own perspective, because very often we are ourselves too close to this phenomena. Very often it gets taken in either regional or political or ideological overtones. So let me tell you the story of the European Renaissance, because in some ways it is easier to think about somebody else in a less biased way. So just like us, in the 14th and 15th century, Europe too was on the cusp of a rebirth. They had, of course, had a period of great economic growth and prosperity and civilization during the Greco-Roman period. But from the 5th century onwards, they too had gone through a long and painful period of decline, what is known often as the Dark Ages. Their place in the world had clearly declined, as other parts of the world, China, India, the Arabs, had taken up that space. And then suddenly, starting with the late 1400s and into the 1500s, there was a sudden change. And it started in a very small place in northern Italy and then spread to other parts of Europe, where a small group of writers, businessmen from a handful of towns, in fact, Florence and Padua and Venice, began to make incredible changes in terms of risk-taking. Now, very often we think of the Renaissance in terms of contributions made to the arts. So if any of you go on holiday or to Florence, you'll see the great cathedral, or you go to Venice and you see the beautiful canals. And that is what we think about when we think about the Renaissance in Europe. But in fact, the Renaissance in Europe was not just about art. It happened in every field of human endeavor simultaneously. So within a few generations, you saw Galileo making huge changes in sciences. The great contribution of Florence was not first of all in the arts, it was actually in banking. It was they who invented double entry bookkeeping. So I have Sri Gurumurti ji, your field of work was actually invented in Florence, double entry bookkeeping. The Venetians, their great innovation was the stock market, at least in its modern form. I mean, there was a form of stock holdings even in India in ancient times. And then this began to spread. This idea of multifaceted risk-taking began to spread. It spread to the Dutch and then crossed the English Channel to Britain. So by the late 1500s, in Elizabethan Britain, you saw, of course, the same people who sank the Spanish Armada were also the same people who were listening to Shakespeare. And it was also the same persons led by Francis Drake who circumnavigated the earth. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because risk-taking as a culture is something which is very important for any renaissance to happen. And this renaissance will happen in India when your generation really begins to see risk-taking in its widest sense, as being really the cusp, being really at the root of what a new India, a Viksit Bharat is about. And I'm saying this because there was, at least when I was a child, a fear of taking risks. And this was in some ways something we inherited from the last many generations, where a people who once were proud as mariners, we know about the great voyages of the Pallavas and the Cholas, they suddenly became afraid of crossing the seas. We imposed on ourselves this idea from the 13th century that crossing the seas was kala pani, or something fearful to do. So when we went through this downturn of the last 800 years, it is not just about the fact that we were invaded and colonized. Much of the colonization and the fear was in our own heads, which is why when we became independent in 1947 and became a republic in 1950, we did not embrace a much more aggressive, unapologetic approach to the world. It is only in the last few years that we have changed the way in which we engage with the world, where we have begun to celebrate startups, where we have begun to celebrate people who leave cushy government jobs and go out there and become athletes, for example, or become writers or businessmen or do other things completely which require the taking of risk. So really, in some ways, we are going back and reclaiming the attitudes of our ancients. The attitude of Kaundi, who crossed the oceans, went to Vietnam, married a local princess Soma, and created the first Indianized kingdom of Funan in southern Vietnam, what is Cambodia today. We are capturing the spirit of Samudragupta, who was not only a great conqueror, who united most of India through his conquests, who defeated the Huns and the Sakas, but was also a very good musician, a great playwright in his own right. We are capturing, in some ways, the spirit of Krishna Deva Raya, who was, of course, a great ruler and administrator, a great warrior and general, but also a great patron of the arts and culture, and a great builder. We are capturing the spirit of many of these greats of history, which we once had, and somehow after independence, we came to fear this business of building big, to build in scale, we somehow thought that, building something like Shastri Bhavan was the epitome of architecture. So it is only in the last few years when we have begun to be able to take risk, be unapologetic about who we are. We have here somebody who has got, of course, going to tell you a little bit about our unapologetic foreign policy lead recently, so give him a round of applause. But this is also a time where we are unapologetic about other things. There would have been another generation who would have been apologetic about rebuilding the Ram temple in Ayodhya. There would have been another generation. There would have been another generation who would have been apologetic about asking for a UN seat in the Security Council. There would have been another generation who would have said, why do we need to hanker for global awards, for sovereign ratings, for all kinds of rankings? Why don't we ourselves create these rankings? Why don't we rate the rest of the world? So this is a change in attitude that you're witnessing. It is in some ways not unique to us. 20, 30 years ago, the Chinese went through this whole change in attitude, and look at what happened. This is not to suggest that we need to completely lose control of it. Nobody's arguing for ultra-nationalism. Nobody's saying that we need to become like the Japanese of the 1930s. Nobody's saying that we need to use this energy to dominate others. But the time has come for us to be unapologetic about the world's largest population, to demand our place and rightful place in the world. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.